Every story leaves something behind. A whisper, a shadow, a question that was never answered. Here, we dig through the forgotten files, the unsolved mysteries, the chilling true crimes, and the horrors people wish had stayed buried. From haunted legends to real-life nightmares, every tale is pulled straight from the horror archives. So turn down the lights, put on your headphones, and step carefully, because once a story enters the horror archives, it never truly leaves.
Lighthouses have always been built on the edges of things. The edge of land, the edge of the sea, the edge of what we're comfortable knowing. Tonight, I have 5 true stories sent in by people who spent time in some of the most isolated lighthouses in the world and came back different. These are 5 true scary lighthouse stories. And this first story is called The Light That Answered Back. It was sent in by a contractor who took a solo maintenance job at a decommissioned lighthouse off the coast of Maine. What he saw from the lamp room one night made him finish the job 4 days early, and what he learned about the previous contractor made him wish he'd never gone at all. And the first time I saw the second light, I told myself it was a reflection. I was 3 weeks into a solo maintenance contract at Pelican Point Lighthouse, a decommissioned tower on a rock shelf about 2 miles off the coast of Maine. The state had hired me to assess structural damage, repaint the exterior, and document anything that needed repair before they turned it into some kind of heritage site. I was staying in the keeper's cottage attached to the base. No running water, no internet, just a generator and a radio that barely picked up the Coast Guard channel. The light hadn't worked in over 40 years. The Fresnel lens was still up there, but the bulb assembly had been removed decades ago. There was nothing in that lamp room that could produce light. I knew that. I'd been up there myself on the first day, but on my 4th night, I was sitting outside the cottage around 11, just watching the water, and I saw it. A single, brief flash from the top of the tower, not the rotating sweep of an active lighthouse. Just one pulse, like someone had struck a match behind the lens. I stared at the lamp room windows for maybe 10 minutes after that. Nothing. I went inside, locked the door, and told myself it was a reflection from a passing boat. The next night, it happened again. Same time, one single flash. This time I was ready. I grabbed my flashlight and went up. The spiral staircase in that tower is 112 steps. I counted every one of them because the sound of my own footsteps was the only thing keeping me grounded. When I reached the lamp room, it was empty, cold. The Fresnel lens sat in its housing, panels of glass and brass all dark. There was no source of light anywhere. No wiring, no battery, nothing. I stood there for a while, catching my breath, and then I did something I can't fully explain. I turned on my flashlight and aimed it out the window toward the open ocean. Just a quick flash, on and off, and something flashed back. It came from the water, maybe a mile out, maybe more. A single pulse of light, pale and cold, answering mine. I dropped my flashlight. It rolled across the floor, and the sound it made echoed through the entire tower. I picked it up and went back down those stairs faster than I've ever moved in my life. The next morning, I walked the rock shelf with binoculars. There was nothing out there. No buoy, no vessel, no structure, just open Atlantic. I didn't flash my light again after that, but the light from the tower kept coming. Every night at 11, one flash, and each night, I swear, the answering light from the ocean was a little closer. I finished the contract 4 days early. I didn't document the last 2 rooms. When the boat came to pick me up, the captain asked me why I looked like I hadn't slept. I told him the wind kept me up. He laughed and said the previous contractor had said the same thing. Then he mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the one before that had never actually called for pickup. They'd found his gear in the cottage, but never found him. I never asked what happened to that man. I didn't want to know, but sometimes, on clear nights, I still think about that light out on the water, and I wonder if it's still waiting for someone to answer. And that second light getting closer every night. That detail stuck with me. The next story takes place at a lighthouse in Washington State, and it involves something a little different. A logbook that seems to have been written by more than one person, even though the keeper lived there alone. And this one is called the Keeper's Logbook. And there were footprints on the stairs when I arrived, and the lighthouse had been sealed for 8 months. I was part of a 2-person historical preservation team sent to catalog artifacts at the Marrow Island Light Station in Washington State. My partner Dana had gotten sick the day before departure, so I went alone. The Coast Guard dropped me off with supplies for 5 days. The lighthouse sat on a narrow island barely 200 yards across, Nothing but rock and scrub grass and the constant sound of the Pacific. The footprints were in the dust on the iron staircase. They went up. They didn't come back down. I told myself an animal had gotten in somehow, though they looked like boot prints, size 10 or 11. I followed them up 3 flights to the watch room, just below the lamp room, and they stopped at a closed door. I opened it. The room was empty except for a desk, a chair, and a logbook. That logbook was why I was there. It belonged to the last keeper, a man named Edwin Praux, who had maintained the light from 1987 until the station was automated in 2003. According to the State Historical Society, the logbook was a detailed daily record. They wanted it preserved and digitized. I sat down and started reading. The first entries were mundane. Weather reports, equipment checks, notes about supply deliveries. But around 1994, the entries started to change. Edwin began writing about sounds, tapping on the exterior walls at night, a dragging noise on the catwalk outside the lamp room. He described it as slow and deliberate, like someone pulling something heavy around the railing. By 1996, he was writing about a figure. He said he could see it from the watchroom window on overcast nights, a shape standing on the rocks below the tower, facing the water. He wrote that it never moved while he was looking at it, but each time he looked away and looked back, it was closer to the base of the lighthouse. I was reading these entries as the afternoon light faded, and I started to notice something. The handwriting was changing. Not gradually, the way someone's penmanship shifts over years. It was changing between entries written on the same day. One entry would be in Edwin's tight, precise cursive. The next, sometimes just a line or two below, would be in a different hand entirely. Looser, larger, the letters slanting the wrong direction. Those entries didn't describe the weather or the equipment. They described the inside of the lighthouse, the number of steps, the dimensions of rooms, the location of doors and windows. They read like someone was taking inventory of the building. The final entry was dated March 2003, 2 days before Edwin was scheduled to leave the station for good. It was in his handwriting, and it said only, "It learned the stairs last night." I closed the logbook. It was dark outside. I hadn't noticed the sun setting because I'd been so absorbed. The generator was running downstairs, and the single bulb in the watchroom buzzed faintly. I sat there in the quiet and became aware of a sound, a slow, rhythmic tapping on the outside wall. Not the wind, not a branch. There were no trees on the island. It was deliberate. Tap, 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 moving upward. I packed the logbook into my bag and went downstairs to the cottage. I locked the door that connected to the tower. I pushed a supply crate against it. I did not sleep that night. Around 3 in the morning, I heard footsteps on the iron staircase. They were slow, and they were going up. When the Coast Guard came for me, I asked them about Edwin Praux. They said he'd retired to a town in Oregon, but when I looked him up later, there was no record of him after 2003. No address, no phone listing, no obituary. The last confirmed trace of Edwin Praux was that logbook. I delivered it to the Historical Society. I never told them about the other handwriting. I didn't know how to explain it. I still don't. And the idea that something was learning the layout of the lighthouse, mapping it, that's a different kind of fear. It suggests intelligence, patience. Okay, this next one goes a step further. It was sent in by someone who took a keeper position in Nova Scotia and found a warning left behind by the person before him. A warning about a part of the building that shouldn't exist. This one is called the replacement keeper. My predecessor at the Grayling Point Lighthouse left a note taped to the inside of the supply closet that said do not go to the basement after sundown. There was no basement listed on the building plans. I checked. I took the keeper position in the fall of 2019. It was a semi-automated station on a headland in Nova Scotia, and the job was mostly monitoring equipment, logging weather data, and performing basic maintenance. The previous keeper had left abruptly mid-contract. The Maritime Authority said he'd had a family emergency, but the way they said it made it clear they didn't believe it either. The lighthouse was a standard concrete tower, about 80 feet, with a small attached residence. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a bathroom. Everything on one level. No stairs going down. No hatch. No cellar door. And yet, on my 3rd night, I heard something beneath the floor. It wasn't pipes. The plumbing ran through the walls, not under the building. It sounded like movement. slow, shuffling movement directly underneath the kitchen. I got on my hands and knees and pressed my ear to the linoleum. The shuffling stopped the moment my ear touched the floor. Like it knew. I went outside the next morning and walked the foundation. The residence was built on a solid concrete slab. There was no crawl space, no access point. I even checked the original construction documents that were filed in the equipment shed. The plans showed a single-story structure on a poured foundation. No basement, but that evening I found a seam in the floor of the second bedroom. It had been hidden under a heavy braided rug. The seam formed a perfect rectangle, about 3 feet by 3 feet, with a recessed iron ring pull that had been painted over to match the floor. It was a hatch. I didn't open it that night. I remembered the note. I waited until noon the next day, when the sun was as high as it would get, and I pulled the hatch open. There were stairs, wooden, old, descending into darkness. They didn't match the rest of the building at all. The concrete foundation should have been right there, but instead there was a rough-cut wooden staircase going down at least 15 feet. The air that came up was cold and smelled like low tide, like seaweed and wet stone. I shined my flashlight down but couldn't see the bottom. The stairs turned a corner. I didn't go down. Something about the geometry was wrong. The stairs were going in a direction that would have put them outside the foundation of the building, extending out toward the cliff. That wasn't possible. I closed the hatch, put the rug back, and moved the bed frame over it. That night around 9, the shuffling started again. This time it was louder, and there was a new sound underneath it. Breathing, slow and wet, like someone exhaling through a mouthful of water. At midnight, something knocked on the underside of the hatch. 3 deliberate knocks. The bed frame vibrated. I was in the kitchen, and I heard it clearly. I grabbed my coat and went to the tower. I climbed to the lamp room and stayed there until sunrise, watching the light sweep across the headland. In the morning, the bed frame had been moved. Not a lot, maybe 6 inches, but I had not moved it. The hatch was still closed, but the painted-over ring pull was now clean and bare, as if someone had scraped the paint away from underneath. I lasted 9 more days. Every night, the knocking got louder. Every morning, the hatch looked more and more like it had been recently used. On my last night, I heard something that made me abandon the station entirely. Footsteps, not under the floor. In the second bedroom, something had come up. I left at first light and radioed for early extraction. The Maritime Authority wasn't happy. They asked me to file a report explaining why I'd abandoned the post. I wrote that the building had structural issues that made it unsafe for habitation. They sent an engineer out 2 weeks later. He found no hatch, no seam in the floor, no staircase, just the note in the supply closet, which someone had added a second line to, in handwriting that wasn't mine or the previous keeper's. It said, "Too late," a hatch that exists when something wants to come through it and disappears when anyone comes looking. That one stays with me. All right, this next story comes from Scotland. It was submitted by a marine biology student who spent 6 weeks at a converted lighthouse research station. What he and his team encountered in the water below. I'll just let him tell it. This one is called The Drowned Light. The girl in the water wasn't drowning. She was standing. The ocean at the base of Cairnmore Lighthouse was at least 30 feet deep at high tide, and she was standing in it with the water up to her chin, perfectly still, looking up at me. I was a graduate student in 2017, spending 6 weeks at the lighthouse as part of a marine biology field study. Cairnmore was on a rocky islet off the west coast of Scotland, accessible only by boat. The lighthouse had been converted into a basic research station. There were 3 of us, me, a fellow student named Rob, and our faculty advisor, Dr. Jen. The first 2 weeks were uneventful. We were studying tidal patterns and intertidal species. The work was tedious, but I liked the isolation. Then Rob started having trouble sleeping. He said he kept hearing someone calling his name from outside. He'd go to the window and see nothing. Dr. Chen told him it was the wind channeling through the rocks. Acoustic tricks. Rob nodded, but he didn't look convinced. On the 15th night, I was in the lamp room cleaning equipment when I looked down at the water and saw her. A girl, maybe 16 or 17, standing in the open ocean. Her hair was dark and spread out on the surface of the water around her head like a halo. Her skin was so pale it almost glowed in the moonlight. She wasn't struggling. She wasn't floating. She was just standing there on nothing, 30 feet above the sea floor. I ran downstairs and woke Rob and Doctor. Chen. By the time we got back to the lamp room, she was gone. Dr. Chen said I'd seen a seal or a piece of debris. Rob didn't say anything. He just stared at the water. 2 nights later, Rob woke me at 4 in the morning. He was fully dressed, standing in the doorway of my room. He said she'd been at his window, 1st floor, face pressed against the glass, wet hair flat against the pane. He said she'd been smiling and that her teeth were wrong, too many of them, crowded together. He said she'd whispered his name and he'd heard it clearly through the glass. Dr. Chen examined the window the next morning. There were handprints on the outside of the glass, but they weren't right. The fingers were too long and they had an extra joint. Dr. Chen photographed them and said it was probably a bird strike or some smearing from condensation. But I saw his face. He didn't believe what he was saying. Rob stopped sleeping after that. He would sit in the common room all night with every light on, facing the windows. He started talking about how the tidal data was wrong. He said the water levels were higher than they should be. He said the ocean was rising around the islet and it wasn't following any natural pattern. I checked his data. He was right. The high tide marks were almost 2 feet above predicted levels and climbing. On the 22nd night, I woke to silence. The generator was still running, but something felt wrong. I went to the common room. Rob wasn't there. The front door of the station was open. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside. I found Rob at the edge of the rocks, standing ankle deep in the water. He was looking down at something. I called his name, but he didn't respond. When I reached him and grabbed his arm, he turned to me with an expression I will never forget. It was blank, not scared, not calm, absent, like whatever made Rob himself had stepped out for a moment. He said very quietly, "She says it's warm down there." I pulled him back inside. Dr. Chen and I took shifts watching him for the rest of the night. In the morning, we called for early extraction. The boat came that afternoon. As we were loading our equipment, I looked back at the lighthouse. There was someone in the lamp room, a figure pale standing behind the glass watching us leave. None of us had gone back up there. The station was empty. Rob recovered eventually, or at least he said he did. He dropped out of the program the following semester. I ran into him once, about a year later, at a conference. He seemed fine, but when I mentioned Cairnmore, his face did the same thing it had done that night on the rocks. Just went blank. Then he said something that has never left me. He said, "She still calls me sometimes. I hear her when I'm near the water." He moved to Arizona after that, as far from the ocean as he could get. I haven't heard from him since. And something about the way it targeted Rob specifically, chose him. That's what makes this one so unsettling to me. This last story is the one that almost made me not include it. Not because it isn't credible, but because of what it implies. It was sent in by a former maritime radio dispatcher who received transmissions from a lighthouse that had been abandoned for 30 years. What those transmissions contained, and what happened after he listened, I'll let you decide for yourself. And this one is called The Last Transmission from Marrow Point. And I need to say this clearly because I don't think anyone else is going to. Whatever is inside the Marrow Point lighthouse is not human. It was never human, and the Coast Guard knows. I was an emergency radio dispatcher for a private maritime communication firm contracted along the Oregon coast. In March of 2021, I was working the overnight shift when I received a transmission on an outdated frequency, one that hadn't been active since the 1980s. It was a lighthouse keeper's emergency channel. The voice was male, calm, and it identified itself as Keeper Elliston of Marrow Point Light Station. The problem was that Marrow Point had been decommissioned in 1991. There was no keeper. There hadn't been one in 30 years. The tower was sealed. The island it sat on was restricted due to structural instability. I responded anyway. Protocol requires it. The voice told me there had been an incident. He said something had come up from the rocks beneath the foundation. He described it as tall and thin and wrong. He said it was standing in the lamp room, and it was wearing the skin of the previous keeper. I logged the transmission and contacted the Coast Guard. They told me to disregard it, not investigate, not flag it. Disregard. The officer I spoke with said, and I'm quoting from my notes, that frequency generates phantom signals due to atmospheric conditions. It happens every few years. Ignore it. I should have listened. Instead, I pulled the archived records for Marrow Point. The last keeper on record was a man named Thomas Elliston, who had served from 1985 to 1991. His departure was listed as voluntary resignation, but there was a note attached to his file, partially redacted, that referenced an incident report I didn't have clearance to access. The readable portion mentioned remains and unidentified biological material found in the lower levels of the tower. The transmissions continued every night for a week, same time, same frequency. The voice never changed. It was always calm, always identified itself as Keeper Elliston, but the content of the messages got worse. On the second night, he described the thing in the lamp room in more detail. He said it had too many arms. He said they came out of its torso at irregular intervals, like branches. He said it moved by folding itself through doorways. On the third night, he said it had started imitating voices. He said it could reproduce any sound it heard. He told me not to trust any other transmissions from the station. On the fourth night, a second voice appeared on the frequency, also male, also calm, also claiming to be Keeper Elliston. The two voices spoke simultaneously, saying different things. The first voice was describing the thing's behavior. The second voice was asking me to send a rescue boat, telling me the coordinates, telling me to come to the island. On the fifth night, only the second voice transmitted. It asked me my name. I didn't respond. It asked again. Then it said my name, my full name. It said it in the exact cadence and tone that I use when I introduce myself on calls. It had been listening to me. I reported everything to my supervisor. He pulled me off the overnight shift and reassigned the frequency monitoring to an automated system. I thought that was the end of it. 3 weeks later, a Coast Guard cutter was dispatched to Marrow Point for a routine structural survey. The crew that went ashore reported that the lighthouse door was open. The interior showed signs of recent habitation. There was food, bedding, a radio set tuned to the old keeper's frequency. The equipment was modern. Someone or something had been living there. In the lamp room, they found marks on the walls, not scratches, impressions, like something had pressed itself against the concrete hard enough to leave the outline of a body. But the outlines were wrong. Too many limbs. The proportions were impossible. The crew was recalled. The Coast Guard sealed the island. A month later, my firm received a notice that the frequency had been permanently deactivated. No explanation was given, but here's what I haven't told anyone until now. The night after the Coast Guard visited the island, I was at home. It was a little after 2 in the morning. My personal radio, a handheld unit I keep on my nightstand, powered on by itself. It was tuned to a frequency I had never programmed. A voice came through. My voice, speaking in my exact cadence, my exact tone. It said, "Something came up from the rocks. It's wearing my skin now." Then the radio turned off and has never worked since. I've moved twice. I don't work in maritime communications anymore. I don't go near the coast. And I have never, not once, tried to find out what actually happened on Marrow Point, because I think whatever is there heard me, and I think it remembers. And that's going to do it for tonight's video. If you have a true scary story of your own, you can send it to me. The link is in the description below. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you soon.
And that's where tonight's file closes, but the archives are far from empty. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and join us as we uncover more horrors, mysteries, and true crimes hidden in the horror archives. Until next time, keep the lights low, keep listening, because you never know what story we'll uncover next.